So, tell us about the NATO attack on Yugoslavia in 1999.
Well, this was a very strange story, but it is relevant to this. The Yugoslavian forces were being attacked by NATO forces in 1999. It was vicious. And the Yugoslavians started using cell phone towers to transmit signals, EMF signals, to the U.S. jets flying overhead, the fighter jets, and they were taking over the computers on the jets and causing them to crash, just to fly into the ground. So something as simple as a cell phone tower can be used to take planes down. And also, you see this plane with advanced radar or high intensity radar. They just took planes out of the air like nothing. It was very easy. So you don't really need a real complicated system. You just need to use what's around you in clever ways.
Right, and the U.S. actually has a documented history of attacking civilian aircraft.
Yeah, and it was the Navy most of the time. United Flight 553, December 8th, 1972, was a U.S. airplane assassination. Dorothy Hunt, who was a CIA member and also the wife of Howard Hunt, was on a plane flying into Chicago with 12 other Watergate figures who were on that plane. And it crashed and burned near Chicago, and all passengers were aboard died. She had over $1 million in cash with her that her husband, who was in prison, Howard Hunt, had blackmailed and extorted from President Nixon. And it wasn't the first time he had been extorting money from President Nixon. So I guess Nixon got tired of it and said, get rid of her. That did end the blackmail, and I think Howard Hunt got out of jail eventually, but he wasn't married any longer. Um, Iranian civilian flight 655, that was shot down by the U.S. Navy July 3rd, 1988, and I believe it was over the Mediterranean. Pan Am Flight 103, December 21st, 1988. That was the Lockerbie, Scotland. Plane crash blamed on Gaddafi and Libya. It was really about Britain wanting the Libyan oil. There's always money behind it. And the CIA was all over that crash. And some CIA agents who had plane tickets to fly on that flight canceled them just hours before that plane flew off. 2011 and 2014 Al Jazeera documentaries that have been made since Gaddafi died and Libya was taken over by European people, military aggression. Those documentaries actually proved that Libya was not involved in the Lockerbie bombing, and it must have been hit possibly by the U.S. or Britain, but more than likely the U.S. But Britain and the U.S. were involved in that. TWA Flight 800, July 17th, 1996, and this was a Boeing 747-100. A U.S. Navy submarine is suspected. They just use our commercial planes for target practice when they want to. They really do. JFK Jr., July 16th, 1999, and this was in a private plane. And what happened is the weather was completely clear, the sky was clear, the media misreported the weather and said that he was flying in dense fog and it was his fault. And there were electronic disturbances of the plane when it was flying, and when they recovered the bodies, apparently there was a bomb in the plane, although it could have been some kind of a weapon, since the government investigated it and could have misreported it. So the NSA satellite chief was so upset over the U.S. government shooting down JFK Jr. that he actually leaked the information and photos and said that the plane had been sabotaged, and he got fired. But he must have gotten some satisfaction out of that. Now, why would they shoot down JFK Jr.? Because JFK Jr. had just told Al Gore that he was running for president of the United States against Al Gore. So these assassinations are frequently used on politicians in the U.S. as well. Senator Ted Kennedy has survived 50 assassination attempts in his career. And in one really bad incident, some kind of an EMF weapon had completely blocked the electrical system on the plane and disabled the electronics so badly that the pilot had to land the plane with mechanical devices only. And I guess the technology was not so advanced that he was not able to do that. He had choices, and he knew how to do it. Senator Wellstone, October 25th, 2002, his plane was crashed. It was a small kind of a puddle jumper plane, a commuter plane. He was going to a funeral, and he had just been campaigning with Senator Ted Kennedy in Minnesota. And people reported that there was no cell phone coverage in the area where the plane crashed. But people with cell phones said they were hearing strange noises on their cell phones and at the time of the crash. And also people living around that area reported that their electronic garage door openers, for no reason, were opening and closing garage doors at the time of the crash. So that indicates EMF disturbance, and certainly the electronics would have been taken out, or the Flight 370 could have been targeted with EMF disabling technologies. Now, why was Senator Wellstone assassinated? Well, he was running for re-election to the Senate, and if he had won, it would have given the Senate to the Democrats. So I guess the Republican Party wasn't willing to accept that, and they probably had a hand in the assassination or other vested interests. Now, just to prove how egregious the U.S. and how facile they are at assassinations, believe it or not, the Space Shuttle Colombia, February 1st, 2003, was shown in photos published in the mainstream media here in the San Francisco area. It showed an energy beam, like a blue light, hitting the Columbia over San Francisco, and the plane began to fall apart. Pieces started falling off over Arizona and New Mexico, and it crashed by the time it reached Texas. When they investigated the space shuttle, heat shield tiles at the site of that beam impact on the space shuttle were melted.
Right. Now, foreshadowing is a regularity that we see around false flag events. And the false flag event of MH Flight 370 has had its own foreshadowing. Could you tell us what foreshadowing is and walk us through the foreshadowing that happened around Flight 370?
Well, certainly from the investigations and interviews that you and I have done, many of them about different disasters, there is definitely a history of foreshadowing false flag events by the media, by political events, by economic disasters, and by statements. For instance, the day before 9/11 happened in New York City, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was started illegally by Oliver North in the Vietnam War. It was a military operation that he brought back to the U.S., and it was renamed from the Federal Emergency Military Agency to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And they were doing a drill in New York City when 9/11 occurred. And the day before 9/11, they announced to the public media that they were predicting three major events in the United States in the future. One was a terrorist event in New York City. It happened the next day, but the terrorist was the U.S. government. The hurricane disaster in New Orleans, that was Hurricane Katrina when George W. Bush was president. It was a land grab. And a major earthquake on the West Coast. We have not had a West Coast yet, but Japan did, and we are downwind from that disaster, and it's going to have a tremendous effect, and millions of people in the United States are going to die from that secret nuclear war on the West Coast, arriving on the West Coast and spreading across North America. There have been other predictions. They use numerology numbers like 666 and Skull and Bones at Yale. You were at Yale. They have a number. What's the number on their Skull and Bones?
322.
322.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened that foreshadowed this disappearance of Flight 370? Well, believe it or not, on February 19th, CNN sent their financial news anchor to Malaysia, Richard Quest, to film a segment on Malaysia Airlines for a program that he anchors called Business Traveler. He also anchors another program on CNN called Quest Means Business. He was born in Liverpool and attended the University of Leeds and also Vanderbilt University in the United States in Tennessee, which is linked to the Oak Ridge Nuclear Weapons Lab in Tennessee. He worked for the BBC and then jointly for the BBC and CNN when he was doing the story on the Malaysian Airlines. He also covered the royal family at times in the UK. And he was a featured CNN anchor until 2008 when he had a mishap in Central Park in New York City in the middle of the night that reframed his role and made him exclusively the harbinger of bad news, or the economic hitman on CNN, announcing the failure, the demise of businesses. So he became the announcer of disasters and bad news. This is from the New York Post. Quote, "This is the same instantly recognizable Dick Quest who was found in Central Park with methamphetamine in his pocket in the middle of the night, 3:30 in the morning. and a rope running from his neck. It was a noose, a hangman's noose around his neck to his, well, let me just quote CNN. CNN personality Richard Quest was busted in Central Park early yesterday with some drugs in his pocket, a rope around his neck that was tied to his genitals, and a sex toy in his boot, law enforcement sources said. He also had a companion, a male companion, and he was admittedly gay. Unquote. In this CNN segment that Richard Quest was filming on Malaysian Air on a flight from Hong Kong to Malaysia was the co-pilot of Flight 370, who is now disappeared, Farid Hamid, who was helping to fly the very same plane that Flight 370 was on, a Boeing 777-200. Is that foreshadowing? Quest indeed was the harbinger of bad news when Flight 370 disappeared, and his segment on Malaysian Air with the very co-pilot in the disappeared airplane on his program. Now, this is just an aside, but a former Navy person, in fact, my web producer and film producer, was drinking with a film crew in Australia in 1980 in Perth. And he was in the Navy and he was out, in the bars. This was right after the Iran hostage rescue event. The Australian World Newsreel crew that he was talking to, they were all sitting at a bar drinking, received a telegram, they told him, without the sender's ID on it, in Honolulu just before Pearl Harbor was bombed in World War II. The crew was told to be someplace at a certain time, to go to a certain hill, a high ground with a view, and they were told the exact number of color film, the exact number of feet of colored film to take with them. They filmed the Pearl Harbor bombing in color. That is another example of foreshadowing.
Right.
As long ago as World War II. This is nothing new.
Yeah, and just to mention that this has been
other foreshadowing. I just like to read a comment that I got from an article. It's we're calling it "Where's Waldo?" was the game, looking for this plane wreck, all these countries and everything, with the satellite people misguiding them. But a comment by a Malaysian at the end of an article called "Malaysian Citizen Perspective on Where's Waldo Cover-Up Artist." Oh, that's my title. The article is titled "Utusan Sees Truth in Theory Blaming CIA for MH370's Disappearance." So this Fumakilla on April 6th posted this comment. This is so funny. "This is not a conspiracy theory. They have personally witnessed it firsthand. Ku Saman Ku Hussein was carrying the two coconuts. Awang Salamat, the bamboo binoculars, led by Ibrahim Mat Zin with the special tongue cut, seated together on the special carpet." This is like the jokes about the dancing Israelis after 9/11 and other events. Are you still there, Alfred?
Yes, I'm here.
Alfred.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Hey, Alfred, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but Leuren doesn't seem to hear me.
Yeah, that's correct. She doesn't hear you. She doesn't see you moving.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah. So let me hang up and I'll call her again.
Okay, we're going to hang up and cycle them over again. All right, when you hang up, wait and let's get everything synchronized.
Yes, I think that my audio was blocked by our outside interference, and I wanted to make a comment about your anecdote on Pearl Harbor. And what I wanted to say is that all of that now has been confirmed and documented by several recent books, which confirm that Pearl Harbor was a false flag operation, and that the President of the United States and the intelligence agencies of the United States, and probably of Britain, were fully informed of this attack, and that it was part of the war policy of the United States. So, in fact, it's strongly argued that it constitutes Article 3 treason under the U.S. Constitution, since FDR and all the intelligence agencies and other military agencies, quote, participated in an armed attack upon the United States, which is the definition of treason under Article 3. I just wanted to mention that. So, given that segue, let's go on to the Malaysian perspective on Where's Waldo?
This is so funny. This is a comment that a Malaysian made. This is their sense of humor. I think it's really cute. The title of the article is Utusan Sees Truth in Theory Blaming the CIA for MH370's Disappearance. And this is a Malaysian citizen's perspective on the cover-up circus. Fumakilla made this comment April 6, 2014. Quote, "This is not a conspiracy theory. They have personally witnessed it firsthand. Ku Saman Ku Hussein was carrying the 2 coconuts. Awang Salamat, the bamboo binoculars. Led by Ibrahim Mat Zin with the special tongue cut, seated together on the special carpet." So there we have the Malaysian version of Where's Waldo.
Right. Now, you are, it may be useful now to go into some of the history of the Zionist attacks by Soros, the City of London, the New World Order on the Malaysian economy, so that people would understand why Malaysia was targeted for this global psyops. Why Malaysia? Why that was important. Perhaps you could share that with us.
Malaysia is a former British colony. And with the New World Order and the history of the people, the bloodlines that make up the New World Order, colonized people, this is their cardinal rule, colonized people should never have any benefit from colonization. And so after World War II, Malaysians fought very hard for their independence from being a colonial dependent on Great Britain. And they finally succeeded. However, the Sultan system in Malaysia is a British system, and there are 5 sultans. Once Malaysia became a republic, basically, constitutional republic, the sultans decided among themselves that each of them would be the king for 5 years, and then it would rotate to the next one. So that's basically a British system, and most people in Malaysia speak English because of the colonial period. So they're very familiar with the British system. Dr. Mahathir, who was prime minister for 22 years, told me, he said, Leuren, first the East India Company gunships arrived. No, first the Portuguese gunships arrived in the 1400s, 1500s. It took us 200 years to get rid of them. Then the East India Company, the British warships arrived. It took us 200 years to get rid of them. Then the Dutch East India Company arrived. It took us 200 years to get rid of them. And he said, and when I became the Prime Minister of Malaysia, I never allowed a single American warship to dock at any ports in Malaysia. That has changed since he stepped down in 2003. The changes to Malaysia that came with Dr. Mahathir, who is himself part Malay, part Chinese, part Hindu. He is a true representative of the peoples who live in Malaysia. And he's a very, very, very nice man. I like him a lot. And I found a news article March 19th that gives another gigantic clue as to what the British and the U.S. are after by staging this false flag Flight 370 disaster. So in the Republican News in Kathmandu, Nepal, on March 19th, quote, Dr. Mahathir was at the helm of the Malaysian government for 22 years, consecutive years. Malaysia has taken a giant leap in the economic development and infrastructures during Mahathir's 22-year-long premiership. Remember, that breaks the colonial rule. The 88-year-old former premier of Malaysia, Mahathir, resigned as an advisor to state-run oil company Petronas Petroleum UL on December 2nd, last 2013. He ended an almost decade-long tenure in the energy major that is Malaysia's only Fortune 500 company. That's what the British want. They want total control around the world of all energy companies. Mahathir resigned from the post of Prime Minister on October 31st, 2003. Now, this was a very interesting comment in a BBC interview the day before, on March 18th, with a former fighter pilot in England. He commented, quote, it has now emerged that Malaysian primary military radar tracked an unidentified contact that flew right across the country's airspace, now confirmed to be MH370. But no action, it seems, was taken. Where was the Malaysian Air Force all this time? Says former RAF pilot and aerospace analyst Andrew Brooks. Quote, ever since 9/11, air defenses around the world have been on alert for a hijacked airliner aiming for a prestige target. And few targets are more prestigious than the twin Petronas Towers in downtown Kuala Lumpur. And I've been a speaker and expert witness at 2 war crimes tribunals that he invited me to. And I've been in one of those towers. He took some of the speakers and we sat at the board of directors table with what seemed like the top of the world. I was terrified. I thought the tower was going to fall over. But he committed the cardinal sin of benefiting the people, benefiting the colonized people, rather than pumping all of the resources of the country into the international financier elite. Anwar Ibrahim, who we mentioned earlier, who was chosen personally by Mahathir to be the next Prime Minister of Malaysia following Mahathir, he stated in his interview, it was posted on Zero Hedge, Captain Zahari, quote, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a father of three, he was the pilot, was said to be a fanatical supporter of the country's opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, jailed for homosexuality just hours before the jet disappeared. So there we have the British agent represented who was due to take over after Mahathir, but ended up in prison, and now he's in prison running for prime minister again. So he would be presumably the handoff of Malaysia to the British now that Mahathir has stepped down from Petronas board of directors, if he does manage to become the next prime minister. Now, his first job offer out of prison on that first conviction was from none other than Wolfowitz, the infamous buddy and member of Bush's cabal, George W. Bush's cabal, and he is now president of the World Bank. He was president of the World Bank. That when he offered Anwar Ibrahim a job at the World Bank as a freshly released convict. Now, what I want to talk about is the war crimes tribunals and conferences that brought United Nations operatives into Malaysia to begin with, and that would have been in 2007 at the first war crimes conference that you and I were invited to by Dr. Mahathir. So it finalized, they also held 2 war crimes tribunals, one for Iraq, and then in 2013, last summer in fact, or this past fall, for Palestine. And I believe that these UN-dominated tribunals also contributed to the information that the UN was able to get about Malaysia through the tribunals, and which facilitated this false flag Flight 370 being carried out in Malaysia. Now, I want to read something from Article 42 of the UN Charter, United Nations Charter. If anyone has any doubts about what the UN is really about, this statement from the UN Charter clarifies it, makes it crystal clear. Quote, "Many people think the United Nations is a peacekeeping organization. The fact is that the United Nations is instead a war organization." And that is from Article 42 of the UN Charter. So what happened is the former secretary for Tun Dr. Mahathir, when he was Prime Minister of Malaysia, is a lawyer called Matthias Chang. And Matthias Chang went to private schools in Britain, and he was also mentored by one of the British dukes who is the head of the Masons in China, the Masonic order that does very strange things around the world and is actually very dangerous. And I saw photographs. In fact, Matthias showed both of us a photograph of himself, a 33rd degree Mason, brought into the Masons by this Duke, whose son was in boarding school with Matthias and was his best friend. And Matthias was standing there with a velvet cape to the ground, trimmed in ermine, with a crown on his head. It was an astonishing and a really shocking photo. And what that told me at that time was that Matthias was actually working for the British, for the City of London financiers, because they started the Masons. And what Matthias did, because Dr. Mahathir told me he had no experience with NGOs or citizen tribunals or anything like this. He said, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about how to carry out a tribunal. But Matthias has set it up and helped me. And these war crimes tribunals and conferences brought three characters, actually four, who are big UN players. Number one is the Ottawa professor Michel Chossudovsky, who has been involved in all of the citizen tribunals. He has a website with that he publishes news on, and a lot of people, especially progressives and intellectuals, like to follow his stories. But his father was very high up in the UN, and here is his adult son carrying on that tradition. Dr. Hans von Spanek was also on the board of directors for these tribunals. Hans von Spanek was the undersecretary of the UN under Kofi Annan, who was also married to a Swedish banking family. And Dennis Halliday, who followed von Spanek to Iraq as undersecretary to Kofi Annan when von Spanek resigned from the Iraq job. And with them came Christian Scherer. He's a Swiss man who works at the Hiroshima Peace Institute on genocide, and he told me himself that he was spying on the Citizens Tribunal in Cambodia for the Pol Pot murders and slaughters, the genocide in Cambodia under Pol Pot. And I said, well, who are you spying for? He said, I'm spying on them. And he said, I'm spying for myself. It took him a little too long to tell me that. That's when I knew he was spying for von Spanek and Halliday and Chossudovsky. So they pretty much were the gatekeepers for the war crimes tribunals and conferences, but Matthias Chang was the puppet master. And he certainly betrayed Dr. Mahathir and his trust. So I was squeezed out. I brought many scientists, and I had the first invited symposium at the 2007 War Crimes Conference at Dr. Mahathir's request. And he said, you're going to do a symposium, and I want you to bring 5 guests, and it will be on radiation as a war crime in this tribunal for Iraq. In the end, Chossudovsky especially was instrumental in getting me squeezed out of the tribunal and all other proceedings in Malaysia. I did manage to attend the 2009 War Crimes Conference because I bullied Matthias Chang into inviting me. And that I was treated very badly there, although Dr. Mahathir was not aware of that. And at the dinner, at the end of that conference, we had a dinner, and Matthias Chang announced to everyone at the dinner table that the depleted uranium issue, which was my topic as a witness, would not be included in the tribunal for Iraq, and and I was completely shocked. And then Shasadowski came running across the restaurant floor and grabbed me and picked me up and kissed me on the lips. It was the kiss of death to the DU issue. It was disgusting.
And in fact, at the Tokyo International Tribunal for War Crimes in Afghanistan, at which you were an expert witness on DU, the use of depleted uranium weapons in Iraq was a central part of the war crimes in Iraq.
In
And
Afghanistan.
yeah, in Afghanistan. And so it should have been in Iraq. And I, as a judge, attempted many times to have that brought, and it was thwarted by the administration. So I can attest to that.
And the University of California, the Nuclear Weapons Labs, Livermore, the Department of Energy, and especially UC Berkeley have harassed me horrifically ever since those tribunals. They never forget and they never forgive. And their mission is to depopulate the global population with chemicals, pathogens, and especially radiation.
So you can say that in a way, the war crimes conferences and tribunals were a foreshadowing of Flight 370.
That's right.
Good.
Absolutely. And so let's talk about what Britain and the U.S. got out of this false flag, Flight 370.
The why. What are the different whys?
Yes.
Well, first of all, we can go to Malaysian oil. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, there were enormous wars that have been fought. Here, they're getting the oil for the price of, in their minds, oh, it's just one civilian airliner. Could you address that?
Well, that's pretty cheap compared to what Iraq and Afghanistan cost the United States, and the British are the ones who benefited.
And Libya.
And Libya, yes.
And British means City of London, which means Rothschild and the 13 City of London Zionist bloodline families.
And the Rothschilds are actually just a public cover story for much older, much deeper, much more hidden vested interests who've been operating this way for thousands of years.
Right.
In fact, the excellent book to read is the Nameless War by a Colonel Ramsey, who wrote the history of all these government overthrows, country after country, with all the looting and the liquidation and the land grabs. That's a really excellent, very excellent book overview, and you can find it on the internet, the PDF. You can download it and read it. I love that book. It's very, very interesting. It's very well written, and it's very correct. And he was a member of the British Parliament who tried to stop World War II. So they put him in prison in 1943 when he published that book, and they let him out the day after the war ended. So, hello?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're back on now. A second area is a second area is recolonizing Malaysia. Britain gets to, in the New World Order fashion, gets to recolonize and liquidate Malaysia as a neo-colony. Could you talk about that?
Yes. In 2009, when I had gone to the War Crimes Conference and the setup of the Palestinian War Crimes Tribunal against Israel, as I was leaving the country, I decided to go and look at some of the former British colonies that are now independent nations to see what happened to them when the British left. Because as a colonized country, the British built infrastructures. It was different in the colonial period, and schools and things like that. But what I saw, not in Malaysia because of Mahathir and what he did to develop the economy and benefit the people, what I saw in Burma or Myanmar, and in Sri Lanka, these are all former British colonies. Thailand was never colonized. I saw countries, also Malaysia, that the British had occupied all of them for tea. They wanted to sell the tea to other countries and to charge huge taxes on it. And tea and gemstones. And in Malaysia, not Malaysia so much, in Sri Lanka and in Burma, they have tremendous gem mines there. They've been mining gems for over 5,000 years. They have an endless supply of gemstones. And so it was tea and gemstones that attracted the British to begin with. When they left, mostly after World War II, and left these colonies as independent nations, what they did was they just economically colonized them and created tremendous poverty, and the governments are corrupt. It's corruption and poverty and bribes, and it's just so sad to go to these countries and see what the British are doing to them now. But always with a cover story. You don't see, it's always a hidden hand of Britain. So when I was in Malaysia, I asked a Malaysian, well, who owns all the tea plantations now in Malaysia? He said, oh, the British, no, foreigners are allowed to own the tea plantations. And I said, well, who owns them? He said, oh, well, it's one Malaysian who owns all of them. And I said, where does that Malaysian live? And he said, London. So then I went to Burma, to Myanmar, and I asked the same question. And the Burmese said, oh, no foreigners can own the tea plantations. And I said, well, who owns the tea plantations in Myanmar? He said, oh, one man. And I said, where does he live? He said, London. And then I went to Sri Lanka, same thing. So the British are still there. They are still liquidating the natural resources and the cheap labor and the hand labor and everything for crops that they could never afford to grow in a developed nation. And the people are so poor. They're so poor. It's much worse than under colonialism. At least they had an infrastructure. The whole infrastructure is falling apart now. And of course, the British always put their own people in, although they look like Indonesians, or they look like, that was the Dutch, they look like Burmese, or they look like Sri Lankans. They're really British agents. And the mechanism is Soros. Should we talk about him now, or shall we?
No, I think that
Okay.
now is a good time.
Now, what happened when Mahathir was Prime Minister of Malaysia is that George Soros did a economic hit on all of the Southeast Asian countries. But it wasn't just the Southeast Asian countries that were affected. However, it did cause a very severe economic crisis in Southeast Asia. And also, George Soros, through Open Society, a foundation he runs, he started funding students from these underdeveloped countries in Central Asia, the oil-rich republics of the former Soviet Union, Egypt, the Middle East, the Gulf states, and even the United States. He's funding students, he's bringing them here. For instance, I see them here in Berkeley all the time, and some of them they've been my roommates from Kazakhstan and Mongolia. And what happens is they get huge amounts of money for coming. It's like a $50,000 handout. They go shopping the whole time they're here. When they go to stores, if they go alone, suddenly someone from their country shows up and takes them shopping all day. And so they are infecting these students from poor countries with American consumerism and American tastes for refined food, soda pop, Coca-Cola, stuff like that, brand marks, cigarettes, things like that. And they go back and they infect all the young people in their countries. They also get funded to carry out revolutions in their families, in their countries. The Iran revolution, student revolution and riots that was funded by foreigners. Those were students who'd gone to other countries and came back to Iran and organized these student revolutions. The colored revolutions in Central Asia were mostly started by students who'd studied in universities abroad, where they basically were turned into CIA agents. And the Soros funded all of the colored revolutions in Central Asia, the Middle East. He funded the Occupy movement in North America. That was all funneled through a private organization full of lawyers that distributed the money to student leaders. And basically, it's an overthrow of the United States. It introduced the takedown of America and the unification of North America. So, what is Soros doing in Malaysia? He's funding students and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, through his Open Society. And so he's building opposition and poisoning young people's minds against their own government and working against prosperity in their own government. It's very sad to see it, but I'm also seeing how universities are involved. And they're very, very, very important. Here at UC Berkeley, the University of California is a big, big player in bringing students from all over the world and basically turning them into CIA agents, or turning them into homosexuals, or turning them into all kinds of things that are not necessarily what the purpose of coming here was all about.
Now, part of the purpose of MH370 was to shred the credibility of the Malaysian government, correct?
That's correct. And what's happened also is that Janet Napolitano, who was the head of Homeland Security, which was based on the Phoenix program in Vietnam, set up by the military, U.S. military, to defeat civilian support of the Viet Cong resistance. That Homeland Security came back to the United States with the military, and it's basically the Phoenix program to be used against American citizens to break this country down. So just a few months ago, Janet Napolitano, who was running Homeland Security, was suddenly hired by the University of California. And she, when she was head of Homeland Security, the U.S. Phoenix program, she signed contracts with 15 countries. She took FEMA and Homeland Security to 15 countries, including New Zealand, and signed contracts to provide services at a cost to those countries. Homeland Security is just Zionism. It's absolutely a Zionist contract, a Zionist treaty, a Zionist program to spread all over the world.
Of the world. Now, I just want to bring up a very sensitive point, and that is that, especially in media, people are very sensitive about the gay movement and about gay things. And when you said bring them here to turn them into homosexuals, I just wanted to make sure that that was not an anti-gay statement. Could you just
Yes,
comment
I'd
on
like
that?
to clarify that. I have no interest or bias or anything in people's sexuality. What I'm seeing is that people who are innocent and would not otherwise get involved in political organizations are recruited through very subtle, very stealthy means here at particularly the University of California. And it isn't that it's a gay movement or an anti-gay sentiment or anything, but they're recruited for political purposes. It's a different agenda than just the right to of choice about your sexuality. It's not about that. They think it's about that. That's the flypaper that brings them here, but they suddenly get pulled into a different agenda, and it's a political movement. It is not about being gay.
This is about uh, uh, social takeover and social invasion of other countries. Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, good. Now, getting back to Malaysia, um, uh, looking at what the U.S. gained of this, you mentioned about military contracts and the militarization of Southeast Asia, and that is one of the outcomes of MH370. Could you comment on that?
Well, I mentioned earlier that the New World Order is planning to mine all of Southeast Asia. These island arcs are ancient seafloor volcanoes. And because of that, they're very, very rich in metals and other minerals that get concentrated in the submarine volcanic process. Now, China is rapidly rising and developing. It's part of this new middle space economy that Brzezinski proposed in the Grand Chessboard. And so, in order to build and develop the economy of a vast region like China, and Russia will probably receive some too, although they have a lot of natural resources, there will be a tremendous need in the next 100 years for lots of minerals, lots of metals, wood, timber, stone work, everything. And so Southeast Asia is very close to China. The Rockefellers have already tried for the last 30 or 40 years to mine some of the islands in the Southeast Asian area without very much success. So there's going to be a very strong, very big military presence needed. The U.S. has already taken over and shares all of the military bases in Australia. Australia is now a lily pad base, a jumping off base for foreign troops, NATO troops, FEMA and Homeland Security, U.S. troops, Australian and New Zealand joint troops to operate in this region. And so the New World Order, the U.S. and the British, also have huge, very, very, very profitable defense industries. They make huge amounts of money selling weapons and war equipment to other countries. And by causing this well, they're hoping it looks like a terrorist attack of Flight 370. They will use it as an excuse to upgrade militaries all over the Southeast Asia region, and they'll even force them to do it. They'll start passing laws that require them to track all of their airplanes by the Inmarsat satellite company in the UK, and they've already stated they monitor all shipping traffic around the world from England. They want to expand into airplane traffic, and as I mentioned, 93,000 flights a day to 9,000 airports in the world is a lot of revenue every day for any company doing that. But basically, Britain wants control of all the tracking. And this represents commerce, it represents money, it represents competitors, it represents a lot of things.
So this is basically in the same way that 9/11 brought in the whole industry of airport security and, the lineups and making you feel like you're in a concentration camp when you fly. MH370 was designed to bring in a new plateau or a new era of global airplane tracking.
Yes, that's correct. And Inmarsat is a big part of it. The Marconi Corporation is a big part of it. Lockheed, Raytheon, all the U.S. weapons manufacturers are a big part of it. And also liquidating these countries. They're going to find ways to liquidate these countries, just like they're doing it to the U.S. now. It's horrific. Homeland Security has gone in and taken over our food stores all over America. We're going to be having food riots before very long all over the United States. And that becomes an excuse to bring in the military, foreign troops to deal with these food riots. All they need is to set up an incident that invites and justifies a response that gives them permission or the authorization to further implement and carry out their agenda of liquidating and countries and their economies and stealing their resources and land and then suppressing the citizens, the people of those countries. That's coming to Malaysia, and that is coming to Southeast Asia. And very surprisingly, Indonesia has at least 3, I think it's 4 HARP facilities, which the Japanese built for them and then trained their personnel, Indonesian personnel, to run them. So Indonesia is going to be a big player in taking down Southeast Asia.
Yeah, so also, kind of in a segue, the whole 30-day psyop around MH3 Flight 370 was state terrorism and was played in the media. Was it hijacked? It was terrorism. They tried to run 2 Iranians on false passports as more terrorism. So this is playing up. Terrorism was one of the subplots in this false flag design.
It's a psychodrama.
Yeah. So was that one of the things that they could play up more of their war on terrorism,
Absolutely.
state terrorism thing?
Yes, absolutely. And you see, Singapore is the key to Southeast Asia, to this takeover. The CIA and the MI6 are operating out of Singapore, and I noticed that because when we were having large databases of personal data from hospitals, from the military, from corporations, were being hacked out of company computers or government computers, I started reading about it happening all over Southeast Asia. Well, that's the CIA doing it, or the U.S. military, and or both. So they have big plans for Southeast Asia, and their plans are not pretty. They never are.
Right. So also then, uh, you can say that their overall plan was to advance a global police state. Is
That's
that
right. And what they're doing now is they want to um, build a Southeast Asian NATO, a consortium. That's what these military exercises are about. Cobra Gold and that other one. It's to bring all these militaries together, get them hyped up about weapons, go back and poison their own countries and parliaments, and bribe the weapons manufacturers, will bribe politicians and so forth, to sell these huge, expensive weapons packages. So we're going to use their soldiers. They're going to be under U.S. command. Their young people, their young men will be sacrificed for the London financiers' gains and benefit. The countries will be bled to poverty by weapons purchases, and some few people will become rich from the bribes. So that's what's happening. It's pretty obvious, and the even the Scientific American, where I got the map of the air traffic zones by country. That magazine, which is published by the National Academy of Sciences, was hyping increased militarism in Malaysia and this region. They needed because of the terrorism. And Flight 370 was the excuse.
Yeah. Now, um, one at least one researcher and a number of articles speculated, and this is one of the scenarios that are out there. During this period, there was a summit of world leaders at The Hague, and there was even an interception by two F-18 fighters, U.S. fighters, uh, of an aircraft, of a commercial aircraft, into the airspace, and so that they thought that MH370 that was being hijacked may have been used as a flying air bomb into assassinate all the world leaders and be the spark of World War III. It's kind of far fetched, but do you have any comment on that kind of scenario?
Well, it sounds like the same people who took down Flight 370 were spreading that rumor,
Yeah,
or using it as psychological, to create psychological fear and
yeah,
everything.
yeah.
And so the bigger the lies, actually, the more people believe them. It's really a tragedy, but by doing programs like we're doing and explaining the steps and the parts and the process for these false flags, we're alerting people so that they can begin to put the pieces together that they have and begin to construct a realistic view and understanding of what's really happening. Then it makes it harder for these false flags to be carried out.
To be
Because,
carried out.
yeah, that's right.
Uh, I what I did as an exercise was to attempt to summarize our whole findings in one sentence. Tell me if this summarizes it. Leuren Moret, colon. Now confirmed, MH370 was disintegrated in midair by U.S. directed energy weapons over Singapore airspace, while UK Inmarsat led a month-long global media psyops for 5 New World Order objectives, including Malaysian liquidation oil grab, militarization of Southeast Asia, Inmarsat global plane tracking, an advancing global police state.
Fantastic. That's really good.
So tell
That'll
me,
put
do
a
you?
lot of tags on the interview.
Yeah, yeah. So, what are your thoughts? I mean, we've kind of you've exposed and really exposed and shredded the whole uh, Flight 370 false flag operation. And credit is really due to Leuren Moret in having done so, and I really want to acknowledge that. And I think that people should be thankful to you that you did. What thoughts do you have that you'd like to offer to our viewers, looking at the shredding of this false flag operation?
Well, if you want to know more, go join the Singapore UC Berkeley Alumni Club, because that's where they're plotting all this stuff. And there are lots of CIA alumni there who look like Malaysians or they look like Singaporeans, but they're working for the New World Order. That's where you find them.
Wow, wow. Well, we're very grateful. We've come to the end of this segment, but we're very grateful for the diligent work that you've spent, over the past month and weeks, deconstructing this false flag for the public good, and taking your time to come on today to really report. And we want to thank and commend you for this public service. And we look forward to your being with us again in the future, Leuren.
Well, Alfred, I just really want to thank you for making me such a naughty scientist. It's really been fun together.
Okay, good enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.